Hello, everyone. Hey, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here and so glad that we can be together. Well, this is my first chance to preach following at the movies, so it only makes sense that my opening illustration or story is a description of a movie scene. And not just any movie for me, actually one of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride. The film is about a grandfather who reads his grandson a book, and the boy is prepared to dislike the book because the title has the word princess in it after all. But the grandfather begins reading it anyway. And the opening chapter is about a young man, a farmhand named Wesley, who allows himself to be ordered about by the daughter of the family he serves, and her name is Buttercup. And he obeys her instructions for the same reason that she gives him instructions. They love each other. Farm boy, polish my horse's saddle. Farm boy, fetch me that pitcher. Farm boy, fill this pail with water. And of course, the pitcher that she wanted was one she could easily reach herself, but it was more fun to tell him to do it. Well, whatever Buttercup orders him to do, Wesley replies with a phrase that all true Princess Bride fans know and recite. It's a 3-word phrase that appears in many GIFs and memes. Are you ready, Princess Bride people? What is Wesley's response to Buttercup? Go. As you wish. Well, today we launch an important teaching series called I Have Decided, and this week's theme could not be more essential for anyone who wants to be an authentic follower of Jesus, who wants an authentic connection with God. It's not an exaggeration to say that if you miss the concept in today's message, or if it is missing from your personal faith, you will never grasp what it means to follow Jesus. But the problem some people have with the passage that we're going to look at is that it is very demanding. It is stark. It is in your face. There's no way you can look at it and say, well, this is a really fun passage of the Bible. It is direct and unapologetic, and that is not the way many people imagine Jesus speaking or talking or challenging his followers. So look at Luke chapter 17, starting with verse 3. Watch yourselves. If another believer sins, rebuke that person. Then if there is repentance, forgive. Even if that person wrongs you 7 times a day and each time turns again and asks forgiveness, you must forgive. Now, most of us are familiar with another passage in which Jesus says that we should forgive not just 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. And here Jesus is saying the same thing, but with a little twist. He says, even if a person wrongs you 7 times today, and then 7 times tomorrow, and 7 times the following day, and the offenses and the sins continue, your obligation before God is to forgive. Now, just before these verses, the ones that we just read, Jesus talks about the power of our example, and he warns us against causing other people to sin. And you've probably heard that part of this passage in some setting before. He says, woe to anyone who causes someone else to stumble or sin. Don't let your influence or your example be the reason that someone else disregards or disobeys God. Comedian Ricky Gervais is known for his crass humor and for his atheism. And when he was 8 years old, his older brother, his hero, questioned Ricky's faith. And from that moment, Ricky determined that he would be an unbeliever, an atheist. Jesus is saying, you don't want to be the older brother who steers someone away from the truth of God. You don't want to be that influence. If you are that person, it will not go well for you ultimately. Now look, I know this is sounding a little fire and brimstone, but if you think that Jesus is too nice to issue a warning like this, then you have an incomplete view of Jesus. Jesus actually said a lot of very direct, stern, even threatening things to those who would reject him or influence other people to do the same. You've heard the acronym DTR, right? You know what it means? It means define the relationship. It's a term that is often used in the realm of dating. If you're single, someone shows an interest in you, but the person is fickle or inconsistent, and this continues for a long, long time, then it's time to DTR. It's time to define the relationship because you don't want to waste your time with someone who's just allergic to commitment. Now, some people play the DTR card like way too early. They're on the second date and they're like, okay, where are we going? And the other person is like, to Olive Garden. But then there are people on the other extreme. They've been dating someone for 3 years or 3 decades, and the other person wants to define the relationship, and they're like, whoa, slow down. What's the rush? Well, Jesus believed in defining the relationship between him and us. He believes in defining the relationship so that we never lose sight of what the foundation of the relationship is. And Jesus would invite people to follow him, and he would let people hang out for a while and listen to him for a while and ask questions and observe. He understood that people need room to make decisions and determine what they believe and how they're going to respond to what they believe. But then Jesus would initiate a DTR, define the relationship moment, or he would preach a define the relationship sermon. And he would say, friend, it is time for you to decide whether you're a fan of me or a follower of me, and I'm calling you to be a follower. And Jesus would say something like what he said in Luke chapter 14, which is a few chapters before the passage we read a moment ago. There, Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else. Your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. You cannot follow me if you have a greater loyalty to someone else. If you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. DTR, defining the relationship. And Jesus did not force people to follow him. He was God, but he didn't force anyone to believe in him or to follow him. He had no desire to take over the government, force people to follow him. But he did require a decision of people, and he did remind everyone that if they chose to follow, it would include suffering. It would include a cross. So Jesus is laying out a basic principle of the Christian life a few chapters later here in Luke 17. And the point is that my example should point people to God's will. My example should not make it easier for someone else to choose not to believe or not to do what God wants them to do. So friend, just be careful what behavior you justify, because we know about forgiveness and we know about grace, and they're so important. They are part of the foundation of our relationship with God because he invites us and he forgives us. But be careful how much freedom you give yourself to sin and then cash in the forgiveness chip. Be careful that you don't teach people to abuse God's grace by the way you relate to God and his grace. And remember, you cannot operate by the live and let live philosophy. You can't, like Charles Barkley, claim, I'm not a role model. I am not claiming to be a positive influence for other people. If people look to your example and it leads them away from God, then God is going to hold you accountable, and he'll hold me accountable. And look, if any of this surprises you, it's just a good thing that you're hearing it today, because all of us need to wrestle with what Jesus requires of us, and all of us need to admit that he's the one who defines the relationship. Some people describe Christianity as if it is a license to do whatever their appetites desire, and then they describe forgiveness as a kind of diplomatic immunity that shields them from any consequences. But Paul told the Galatian Christians, you're going to reap what you sow. Yes, sins are forgiven, but the consequences can be devastating. And Paul told the Corinthians, and Corinth is like the Las Vegas of his day, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Now, let me make all of us uncomfortable for a moment by asking you to read that last sentence aloud with me. It's therefore honor God with your body. Let's say that. Therefore, honor God with your body. Is there any idea that is more contrary than the gospel of this age and what the world is telling us? Because the world is telling us, I can do whatever I want with my body. And friend, God is saying that everything you do with your body should honor God. And if you can't figure out how God can be honored by it, you shouldn't be doing it. Sex, gender, abortion, food, alcohol, any decision that involves my body, it is always God's business. And that's why the Bible gives instructions on all these things. Why? Because my body is not mine. It belongs to Jesus. He purchased it on the cross. He allowed his body to be hung on a tree. He sacrificed his body. And now our bodies belong to him. But after teaching that sin should be avoided, Jesus teaches us what to do when people sin against us. We talked about this a moment ago. He says that if a person sins against me but repents, then I am obligated to forgive and forgive again and forgive again. No gossip, no grudges, no limits if the person asks to be forgiven, Jesus said. Now, what do you do if the person is not repentant and does not even admit that they sinned against you? Well, that's a different question, a different sermon. Jesus doesn't answer that question here. But if a person seeks forgiveness, Jesus makes it very clear. You and I are commanded to offer and extend forgiveness. And Jesus is saying all of this to these people who are trying to figure out if they are going to follow him. And they respond like he's speaking a foreign language. Look at Luke 17, verse 5. The apostles said to the Lord, "Show us how to increase our faith." Now that sounds like a sincere request, and I think it was sincere to a point. But do you see what they are doing? Jesus tells them, your example must lead people to God, not away from God, and you must forgive people who do wrong to you. And then how do they respond? They respond by saying, show us how to increase our faith. They are dodging. They're trying to shift responsibility for forgiveness from themselves to God. And what they are saying is, Jesus, wow, you're describing something that requires a miraculous amount of faith. So you're going to have to give us more faith. You're going to have to give us the faith to do these things because we just have to admit we can't do it. And Jesus says essentially, you don't need more faith. You just need to employ the little bit of faith you already have. And friend, I want you to know that is a life changer. It's a game changer when it comes to your relationship with God. When you stop telling yourself, I just don't have enough faith to obey God, and you start putting the little bit of faith that you have into practice, then that faith is going to grow. And it's going to become the most powerful force in your life. Look at verse 6 of Luke 17. The Lord answered, if you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, may you be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Now, most of you have heard some version of this verse before, mountain thrown into the sea if you have enough faith, but you may not have realized that these words are not just a promise from Jesus. These words are a correction from Jesus. For all of us who say, I just need more faith, I just need more faith, God, give me more faith. For all of us, God is saying, no, use the faith that you have. Employ the faith that you already have, and it will grow. Look, friend, God probably did not lead you to Westside today so that you could learn a new Bible thing. I mean, if you do learn something new, that's great. It's not bad to gain fresh knowledge from the Bible, but most of us do not need more knowledge. Most of us are trying to learn something that's going to change our lives. Jesus wants us to do something that is going to change our lives. He wants us to put our faith into action. Most of us need more action based on what we already know. A new Bible fact is not the best thing that you can get from this gathering today. The best thing you can gain from this moment is the determination to exercise the faith that you already have. What God brought you here for is the opportunity to say, I have decided. I am going to act on my faith. I am going to follow Jesus in every way that he has invited and commanded me to follow him. And yes, I know, I've heard that before. I mean, we've all said that. So most of us don't need new information. We need a fresh and sincere way of acting on the information we've already been given. We need to say, I have decided. I'm going to live by faith, walk by faith. I may have only a little bit, but I'm going to put it into action. I'm going to press the seed in the ground and see what God does. And how do we take that step? How do we do that? Well, I will not pretend that there are not multiple answers to those questions. But here in Luke 17, Jesus is about to reveal one of them. He is about to reveal a perspective that you and I need about ourselves if we are going to understand this relationship that God has defined for us. Let's read verses 7 through 10. Jesus says, when a servant comes in from plowing or taking care of sheep, does his master say, come in and eat with me? No. He says, prepare my meal, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat. Then you can eat later. And does the master thank the servant for doing what he was told to do? Of course not. In the same way, when you obey me, you should say, we are unworthy servants who have simply done our duty. Every follower of Jesus is called to be a servant and to recognize that that is the relationship that we have with God and with Jesus. And every follower of Jesus is called to do God's will regardless of how we feel. Being a Christian is more than being a servant, but being a Christian is not less than being a servant. You know, there is a reason that many of us have not heard this parable taught very often. And the reason is that it is stark and challenging. And the reason is that there is a 4-letter word in this passage. Did you see the 4-letter word? The word is duty. Modern people do not like the notion of duty. We feel pressured and manipulated when someone talks about our duty. Duty is very out of style. With many people, it's counterproductive to even mention it. And people think, well, if you try to convince me that it's my duty to do something, then forget it. Now, Jesus does talk about rewards in other teachings, and he explores other motives for obeying God. And look, God promises that he will reward those who are faithful to him. But this parable reminds us that even if God does not reward us, even if God does not offer us some wonderful gift or blessing, it is still our responsibility to serve him. Do you know what your duty is before God? Jesus uses this word in his teachings, so I want us to consider it. Duty means that there are some obligations that we owe regardless of how we feel and regardless of the consequences. How many of you were here for last week's At the Movies message? Were you here last week? Okay, most of you. And do you recall how Desmond Doss in Hacksaw Ridge felt obligated to serve in the military, even though he would not fire a weapon? Even if he died on the battlefield because he was unable to defend himself or unwilling, he was what our ancestors used to call duty-bound. When's the last time you heard someone explain their actions by citing their duty? Well, Jesus says that each of us has a duty to what? To be God's servant. It's part of our relationship to God. It's part of the foundation of that relationship. A lot of us want to be God's child. We want to be God's voice. We want to be God's instrument. We want to be God's leader. We want to be God's beloved. But where is the duty-bound servant of God? It just doesn't have the same appeal, does it? Friend, how can you and I determine whether or not we are authentic servants of God? Well, let me just describe 2 traits of an authentic servant so that we can all do some self-evaluation to determine if we really qualify. And by the way, I know this part of the message is not the most entertaining. It may not even be pleasant to hear. So I want you to know this isn't the ultimate destination for today's message or our relationship with God, but it's so important as a foundation. And I think it's a crucial part of the path that has to be traveled if you and I are going to relate to God the way He's inviting us to relate. So first of all, a servant realizes that God owes him or her nothing. Now that's funny because for some of us, the totality of our relationship with God is asking God for things and then hoping or expecting that God will give them. And the Bible invites us to ask God for what we want and for what we need. So it's not wrong to do that, but for some of us, that's all of our communication with God, that we want God to give us something or do something for us. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't met a lot of people who believe that God owes them nothing. In some translations of the Bible, the servant mentioned in these verses is presented as a slave. Now that word has a lot of baggage in our country for legitimate reasons, but the servant or the slave that Jesus is talking about here is not the type of slave that we know from American history. The slavery that we know from our history was based on race, and the people who were enslaved were considered the property of someone else. It was not just their time and effort that belonged to the master, it was the person himself or herself. It was profoundly degrading and abusive. But the form of slavery that Jesus knew and described in this passage involved someone who owed a debt that he or she could not pay. And when that happened in Jesus' day, bankruptcy was not an option. The courts would not say, okay, you don't owe that money. The person could be thrown into debtor's prison, or if the lender agreed, the person could work off the debt as a servant to the person to whom they owed money. So Jesus is right. A person in those circumstances, after feeding the animals and working in the field, would not walk into the sitting room and expect the master of the house to say, hey, sit down and eat this meal with me. No, the servant's attitude would be, this man, this woman owes me nothing. And anything that was given by the master would be deeply humbling to the servant because the servant knows, this person owes me nothing. So friend, if you are a true servant of God, you are not thinking that God owes you something. A true servant of God sincerely believes that if God never answered another prayer, if God never gave another blessing, God would still be good. He would still be the master, and I would still choose to be his servant. That's why the Apostle Paul, who had done so much and sacrificed so much, did not speak of himself as a church or Christian big shot. He spoke of himself as a bond servant, a slave of Jesus Christ. And that's why the apostles, when they were being persecuted and mistreated, when they were being beaten for speaking the name of Jesus, counted it a joy to suffer for him because they did not believe that God owed them something better or something else. Let's get real. Some of us have sometimes an unspoken anger with God because some part of our lives has not played out the way we expect. Our career didn't take off, or it took off and then it crash landed. Or our parents did not cherish us the way they should have. Or a fiance or a spouse left, or truly didn't love you, or you've not had a spouse, though you wanted one, and you would have been a devoted and loving spouse. Or your health deteriorated through no fault or abuse of your body on your own. Or a loved one died. One of my pastor friends just posted an hour or so ago that his daughter has passed away. Listen closely, friend. Because I am not saying that those things are no big deal. I am not saying the pain from those things is not real. And I am not saying that God does not care about that disappointment and pain, because he cares deeply about it. All these things are profound losses. And that is why some of us feel justified in our disappointment with God or our anger toward God. Or maybe you're just permanently, chronically sad about it. And if you're honest, even though you're in church today, you feel unloved or unseen by God. And when people list similar blessings to the ones you lost or do not have, when they list those on social media, you feel like the neglected child. And it's hard not to feel bitter. But it is not God who has hurt you. It is not God who has ignored you. It is the underlying assumption that we allow ourselves to embrace that God owes us these things. God owes us blessings. He owes us a yes answer to the requests that we make of Him. Now, does God answer yes? Does God often bless? He does. But He doesn't do it because He owes you or owes me. And even though God has given you many other good things, because you don't have the one good thing you most want, or at least want now, you've concluded that God isn't as good as people say. But will you please hear this? If you replace the false assumption that God owes you with the conviction that you are God's servant and He doesn't owe you anything, and that everything He has given you has been out of His grace and generosity and goodness, then your disappointment and your anger are going to dissolve. They're going to evaporate. And you will be the grateful, truly thankful person that you want to be, in spite of the fact that you don't have everything that you can think of to desire. And this is why it's so important for all of us to admit that we are God's servants and He doesn't owe us. Because a servant cannot be owed anything. That's the first trait of a real servant. Here's the second characteristic of a true servant. A servant obeys everything the master says. Not most, but everything. Let's go back to verse 10. I memorized this verse a few years ago, and it's just brought me back to a balance point with God many times since then. Look at what it says. So you also, when you have done, what's that word? Everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Yeah, that's what we do when we obey everything that we're told to do, right? We just say, yeah, I'm an unworthy servant. That's what I should have done. No, we say, did you see me? Did you see me do you know what I did? I didn't just do some or even most of what I was told to do. I did all of it. Can we all just stand and applaud me now because I did everything I was told to do? I mean, not me. There really are emotions and thoughts like that in our hearts. But how much of the master's will is a servant required to do? Everything. How many of the master's commands does a servant have an obligation to follow? All of them. And after doing so, what does a real servant say? Not, I am awesome. Not, I deserve a big reward for this. No, the servant says, this is how it should be. This is how I, a servant, should live my life. I should give nothing less. Now, maybe you're having trouble seeing this sermon and this message as good news. But I promise you, it is good news. Maybe some part of you sees this as an obligation, or maybe it even sounds unfair. But this is what I want you to know. The happiest people on earth are devoted servants of God. The people who adopt these characteristics of a servant, they are the most content, happiest people on earth. Do you know why? Because those who truly commit themselves to God's service do not look to the world for fulfillment. You know, study after study has shown that people of our generation are less happy than our ancestors were. Now, we are far better off in so many ways. I mean, we live such comfortable lives. I mean, all of us have seen the forecast for this coming week. There's a heat wave coming. The vast majority of us, almost all of us, are not going to have to worry about it because we live in air-conditioned dwellings. Our cars, by the way, we have cars, and a lot of our ancestors didn't. But even for those who had cars, our cars are smoother riding, more high-tech. Our homes are bigger and tricked out with gadgets and appliances and entertainment systems. We've got little devices in our houses that we just tell them what to do and they take care of it. Our clothes fit better, more comfortable. We've gathered more knowledge than our ancestors had. We know stuff. We should be happier than our ancestors, but we are more miserable than our ancestors. Why is that? Because as a culture, we have traded the truth of God for lies. And we've traded some spiritual truth for spiritual lies. We've traded the spiritual truth that we are a servant of God for the lie that God owes us things and owes us everything we want. And the price for thinking that way is that we are unhappy. It's deep unhappiness because we can't be satisfied. This is what Jesus said. You are blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He is the food and drink in the best meal you will ever eat. So I have decided that I will follow Jesus anywhere, and that I will be his servant, and that I will not pretend that he owes me anything, and I will not treat God as a cosmic vending machine. I will serve him all of my life, and then every good thing that my generous master gives me that I do not deserve, I will count as a true blessing. So who's with me to decide that and live that way?